So here's my problem. I keep reading or watching these very frustrating videos where people who are atheists or agnostic are arguing against the existence of God, against the major arguments for God. And on the other side, you have often Catholics or religious people arguing in favor of these arguments. And I don't think they're very strong arguments. And I think a lot of the attempts to debunk them really miss some rather obvious flaws. So in this video, I'm going to attempt to debunk 10, let's say about 10 of the most common arguments for the existence of God. Hey there, one viewer. I wanted to preface this video with some stuff I didn't record to offset some of the obvious criticisms of it. One, this video doesn't attempt to disprove God. I say that in the video, but some people are going to get confused. It's a criticism of specific arguments in favor of God. Second, I don't know all these arguments perfectly. I read them some time ago and I've reviewed them recently, but I could be missing nuances or some other elements of any one of these arguments. I'm not trying to straw man these arguments. I'm trying to do the best job I can to show what I believe them to be, but if I've missed a component or I've said something incorrectly or simplified something that really shouldn't be simplified, I accept that criticism. And finally, if you have any criticisms of me personally, you think I don't have the correct credentials, you think that I'm obviously not a university professor, although I've studied it at university, I'm not a PhD, or maybe I don't look good to you, sound good, my audio isn't good, my video isn't good, or you think that I'm some kind of person that you can't trust. I can accept most of those criticisms, to be honest. I'm not the greatest person in the world. I'm not the most articulate. So really most of the criticisms you levy against me personally, I think, are fair, but they don't really challenge the underlying argument. If I'm the worst person in the world, horrible at speaking, terrible at expressing myself, and indeed make many missteps or even burp constantly while trying to speak, those are valid criticisms of me as a person, but they have nothing to do with the arguments as a whole. So I hope you enjoy this video and you examine it on the grounds in which it's intended. That is, as a philosophical examination of particular proofs for the existence of God. It's fine to critique. It's fine to be to find yourself in different opinion. It's fine to think that I'm imperfect in my analysis. I just hope that you listen to this in good faith. Thank you. But not because I hate God or am really strongly anti-religious. I actually think that it's perfectly fine to have religion. A lot of people who are atheistic are very anti-religious, and I don't think that religion is that big of a problem. I mean, you can argue there's many wars and conflicts and other issues that where religion has been used as the cue to say, well, this group of people are evil, this group is good, and we should follow the good people, not the bad people. And it's religion that has been used to that. But I think that's just a mask, usually just a mask for an underlying political economic issue, an issue of power struggle, an issue of that is more endemic to structures and to individuals than it is about what we're hanging those beliefs on. A lot of times when we attack other countries, we will give the story that they're heathens or evil or that they believe in a religion that is just untenable and they have religious beliefs that are harming us. But really, we're there for the oil, we're there for the land, and if it wasn't religion, we would choose some other metric. I also know many people who are religious, and I think it's fine if you want to believe in God or in religion of any kind. As long as you don't tell me I have to do it or tell me what I have to believe or how I have to act, I don't really have a problem with it. And in fact, I don't think we as a society should really care, even if the religion seems insane to us. When we break down almost any religion, we see internal contradictions. So I think it should be fine for people to say, all right, you have this religion, I have this other religion, or I have no religion. That's all fine. You follow your own beliefs as long as you're not harming the internal, like the members of your religion. I don't have really a problem with it. And as long as you're not deciding legislation based on this, I don't have a problem with it. My problem is with the arguments for the existence of God, the attempt to logify or logic your way into God. Because I think God is an inherently irrational concept. Not bad irrational, just irrational. In other words, it can't be proven through rationality or logical reason. It is an idea that transcends logic. The most common problem facing the Christian God, or the idea of the supreme God, is the idea of the God creating a stone that he himself cannot lift. If he can't lift it, it means that he doesn't have all powers. There's something that is more powerful than the thing that he created is actually more powerful than he is. But if he can't create it, then it means he's got limitations on his abilities. Maybe they're limited by logic or what's possible within the universe. A all-powerful God should be able to create a stone that he cannot lift and also be able to lift it. And that doesn't seem to make sense in a rational sense. And therefore, maybe the best way to believe in God is to say, it's not a rational belief. It's a feeling I have. Maybe it's true that God exists and it exists beyond logic. Is something that transcends logic. And that's fine. That's a belief to have in God. But as far as the common arguments for the existence of God based in logic, I think they all have relatively massive and relatively easily exploitable flaws. You might be saying, well, geniuses, great thinkers throughout history, Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, various other great thinkers, Descartes, all said that God exists. How can you say that you can disprove it so easily when these geniuses, these great thinkers, couldn't, when they came to the conclusion that God must exist? Well, the reason's relatively obvious. History has moved forward, and what was not possible to think of 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, is quite easy for us to think of now. The average school child can think of mathematical constants, even in kindergarten, or linguistic concepts that weren't possible to imagine in the Greek times. We have new knowledge. There was a period where the Western culture didn't have a concept of zero, and now adding zeros to things is commonplace. So there are many ways of thinking that are common now that weren't common 1,000 years ago. So we should expect that we have the ability to think through problems they didn't have. Now you might say, well, there's so many problems though that they came up with or that they imagined that we wouldn't be able to do today. And that's fair enough. We exist in different times, but there are some things that are easier for us to think of or conceive of now than they weren't in the past. I also think that some of these thinkers were being a bit disingenuous. Maybe they were afraid of the church. Maybe they were strong believers and they were surrounded by strong believers and they wanted these things to be true. I think there are certain cases where their arguments can't be said to be fully engaged with. An example would be Descartes, who came up with the famous analysis that we now say, I think, therefore I am. Those weren't his words, but that was the general gist of his argument. If I am thinking, or if there is a thought, there must be something to do that thinking. Therefore, if I am thinking of anything, at least something must exist to do that thinking. I would argue for it to be me is to sort of assume that we understand how consciousness works and there isn't some great other way of understanding consciousness. But in Descartes' concepts, I think therefore I am is a great thought. It's a great first starting point to question what we know about the universe. And he indeed took apart a lot of ideas and said, well, these things aren't necessarily true, so how do we prove that? And he started with, I think, therefore I am. And then he moved into an argument that basically said, well, and God exists, and God would never deceive us, so therefore all the other things we observe must be true. That argument, if you read it, as I have, in my opinion, it isn't a very strong connective tissue. But this is where I think Descartes had a great first thought and then went on with some culturally accepted beliefs and moved on through those rather quickly. In other words, I don't consider his arguments for the existence of God to be fully fleshed out compared to his other thoughts. And therefore, I would say that a lot of these early arguments for the existence of God are just people who want God to exist and therefore don't question it and do very deeply, or are afraid of what would happen to them in terms of heresy, in terms of torture, if they did say that God definitely doesn't exist. They need these arguments to exist in order to do well. People like Thomas Aquinas, who questioned the existence of God, must ultimately come down on the side of God because that's his job. So I think it's much easier now for an average person of average intelligence to debunk these arguments than it was in the past, but I think sometimes philosophers get caught up in the minutia of it. So I'm going to go through 10 arguments. I have read multiple books on the existence of God, multiple philosophical texts I've studied at university, but I also recently went through YouTube videos, Wikipedia articles, and other online articles to find what are some of the most common articles here. This one that we're looking at now is the one that I found that most succinctly put the top 10 most common arguments for God. And I'm going to go walk through them and I think relatively easily debunk each of them. And I don't mean this in an because I'm so smart. I just think that they're not particularly strong arguments, and it doesn't take a genius to debunk them. The argument in favor of God is more like a feeling or a belief in faith or something like that that isn't based on rationality. So let's take a look at these arguments and how quickly we can relatively easily debunk these. So let's take a look at the first argument. The first argument, and one of the most common and most powerful ones, is called the cosmological argument. That's the argument that everything has a cause, and if you break it down and go back far enough, there has to be an original cause for everything. Let's take a look. For example, if I have this little tiny screwdriver here and I drop it, the cause of it falling, you might argue, is me letting go of it, and that causes it to fall. Something had to cause that object to propel down to the ground. We would say that's the laws of gravity, but also I'm the one who started off by holding it and letting go. If I hadn't done that, it wouldn't have fallen. And there had to be a reason why I picked that up. The reason I picked that up is because I wanted to make a point. I wanted to prove something visually. And the reason why I wanted to prove something visually is how I was taught, and so on and so forth. And you can go back through causality and go all the way back to the first cause. And indeed, if you look at the universe and our conception of the Big Bang, right? We say that everything, scientifically anyway, started with this Big Bang. But what caused the Big Bang? Something had to cause it, because to say that if we say that everything has a cause, then something must have caused that Big Bang, and the argument is that cause is always greater than the original thing before it, and so at some point the thing that created it must be outside of time, must be outside of reality, because again, we're talking about the beginning of time. Before time even existed, something must have created time and put it there, so it must be beyond or outside time, and it must be outside of our understanding, because it must exist outside of the universe in order to do that. In other words, it must be an extra universal being, and we say it must be a personal God because it must have decided to create everything. It must have decided to create that Big Bang. It must have decided to create all that matter. Or else, what did it? Well, first of all, everything we've observed does have a cause. That's, so far, seems to be true. At least we can imagine that it has a cause. We don't really know for certain because we haven't examined and couldn't possibly examine all actions in the universe. It may be that some things aren't caused. Maybe, for example, that some energy is spontaneously created in the universe, or matter is spontaneously created in the universe, using a law or a scientific theory that we don't currently have. Now, I might say that's speculative, but we're talking about the existence of God here, a massive concept, and saying that everything had to have a cause leading back to the Big Bang, and so something must have caused that. But we don't know that that's true. We don't know that first law that says that everything has a cause is true. We just know that about everything we've seen so far. There could be things that are uncaused and just randomly created. Indeed, there could be that God plays dice with the universe, except for the God part is actually true. That there are, maybe over the billions and billions of years of the universe, there are small amounts of matter or things that have been created. Indeed, there's some theories that suggest this. So we don't actually know that everything has a cause. Given that, maybe there's only one thing that didn't have a cause. Maybe that first Big Bang bit of matter wasn't caused by anything. It just has always existed. Other scientists have said that the idea of existing before time doesn't make sense. Time is just causality. Time is just moving things forward. It's not an ether that you can reach out and touch. It's literally just objects moving through space is what time is. In other words, time and distance are connected together. They're part of the same continuum. So if we look back and say that really to say before time doesn't make sense, something happened before time, because in order for there to be time, there must be something happening. So if we imagine that at the beginning of the Big Bang is the beginning of time, to imagine something before that caused it is irrational, because if something happened before that, then there would have been a universe. There would have been a thing to happen. If we imagine before their Big Bang there must have been something that caused it, then we must say, well, something caused that as well. And something caused that as well. Something caused that as well. In other words, if God existed, who created God? Why did they create God? Was it a God before that God? And you start getting into this string of causality that goes back even further and even more infinite directions. In other words, putting God in the picture doesn't help us answer the question of causality at all. It just gives us another point. We're just imagining that there's something that created the universe. But what created that God then? What created that God and that God and that God? You go back and you just keep adding more causes. At some point, you just have to say that either this is a cyclical universe that has just continued to exist and is just a cycle, or the universe itself just began through some process, or didn't begin, it has always been here. And if you think about it this way, imagine that the universe didn't exist. Would we be asking this question? Well, no, we wouldn't be here to ask the question. There'd be no questions to ask. So if the universe is just arbitrary, that it just came into being or has always been in existence, if that was true, then we would be here asking this question. And if it wasn't true, we wouldn't be. In other words, it's not some massive coincidence that the universe just happened to exist. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't be asking this question. So there are possibilities or ways to imagine a universe, or a universe that never had any matter in it. It's possible to imagine that. But if that's true, if there's no matter or energy in the universe, then there's nothing to question. So it could very well be that the universe has just always existed, cyclically, or it just happens to exist, and that's why we're asking the question. Or it could be that there's a cause before a cause before a cause, but then adding God into the mix doesn't help us in that regard anyway. We have to go back and find out what caused God. If you say, well, God just created himself and that solves it, why not just say that the universe just created itself? What's the difference? Or why not say that God created itself but isn't all powerful, and it was just sort of a cause that, just sort of a cause. It isn't a person or a deity or a being. Like, for example, I just dropped this very small object, but I could have hit a snowball at the top of a hill, and it could have rolled down the hill and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and eventually crashed into a building and destroyed it. Does that mean I'm powerful enough to destroy buildings? No. It means that I touched off an effect that had a bigger and bigger effect. So even if we say that there was a God that created the universe, he may have just created this dense box, and that might be his only ability. Saying he might be silly here, but there may have been a being that created the universe but wasn't all powerful. Just managed to create this thing, or start off the process that caused that thing to be created, and still isn't powerful, isn't a personal being. So, to break it down, we don't know that everything had a cause. It may be that the universe just existed without God. And it also might be that even if we say that there's God, that we don't know what caused God to exist, and God might not be all powerful. God may have just been the one who pushed the ball down the hill. So there's at least 4 major and obvious flaws with this argument. You also might argue that the universe maybe is just cyclical and has always been, or maybe it's a simulation and somebody has created it who is more powerful than us, but just like the programmer who can't fix all of his bugs, maybe this creator isn't like an interactive, all-knowing God, but is actually just somebody fumbling around in a lab. So even if we accept that somebody created it, it might not even be somebody who was particularly powerful. It might just be that there's a series of events that unfolded. So there's at least 5 major flaws with this argument, and we could keep going. The essential problem is that it doesn't prove anything about the existence of God. It could be wrong, and if the argument is based that it necessarily follows that, but it doesn't necessarily follow that, then there's no argument. There's nothing here to argue about. Essentially, we're just speculating that somebody created the universe, and that speculation may as well just be faith. So the cosmological argument has no value. It's an interesting thought experiment, but it doesn't prove or disprove God. You can have that single cause theory and still not prove the existence of God anyway. So it's kind of worthless in the existence of God argument. So the second proof is the teleological argument. That's the idea of from design, that basically that when you have some high level of complexity, this level of complexity in order couldn't just come about. In fact, many people will point out chaos theory reigning, that and in terms of things fall apart, things the center cannot hold, the falcon is set loose from the falconer, through all these ideas that chaos is the natural state of the universe. Entropy is the ultimate way that all things will end up. Everything will die in heat, death, and entropy. So how do we explain the extremely ordered nature of the universe if it wasn't put there by a designer? How do we talk about the universe and all of its unique laws and say that somebody didn't come up with those laws to hold it all together? Well, the obvious and easiest response is the universe is not orderly. It is chaotic. There's things smashing into each other. There's explosions everywhere. There's a lot of luck and happenstance. You might say, well, why are humans able to experience the universe? How did we manage to be here when there's so many empty planets? Except that's exactly what somebody was studying combinatorics or chance would say, that with all the many planets and stars and things in the universe, it was bound to be that there would be different life forms on different planets, and some of them would be intelligent and have self-consciousness. That just through random chance, that's what we would expect to happen, at least in part of the universe. Imagine a universe with no life, with no planets just floating around. The likelihood of all that matter not creating anything anywhere, of there being no order or organization anywhere, is almost impossible. If you take a handful of sand and you throw it into the air, almost certainly some of it will fall into recognizable patterns. And so the idea that the universe is orderly is simply untrue, and to the degree that it is orderly, it's easily explained through random chance. That things could fall into an order in certain areas of the universe or pockets of the universe, while other areas spiral out of controllably. And indeed, the laws of the universe, of gravitation, of electromagnetism, anticipate that certain things will come together, that we should have things like planetoids, like various planets, like various stars. All we need is those various scientific laws in order to explain how those things come together. We don't need God in order to say that stars and things come together. Now you might say, but there's an elegance in the laws of nature and then the laws of the universe. There's an elegance to them. And I would argue that there just simply isn't an elegance to them. They can help explain things, certainly, and there's some beauty in mathematics, but there's all kinds of logical and scientific problems we experience every day with our scientific laws, and some of them don't, that while they work together, they don't really make sense to us on like an intellectual level. The idea of string theory or of multiple dimensions are just really hard for us to understand. They are not these beautiful, perfect things, but actually they're kludgy and just strung together, and it's through happenstance that they seem to be working. We're always finding flaws in our understanding of the universe. So the universe isn't easy to understand. It's not a clockwork. It is chaotic. That's just a fact of the universe. So to say that the universe is a clockwork creation, simply not true. And so the argument that God must therefore have existed doesn't follow from that at all. And even if the universe did act like clockwork, even if the universe was extremely well organized and everything made sense, and we figured out the laws of the universe, and we could harness those to create Star Trek style spacecraft, and we understood all the laws of science, and it all seemed to make sense to it, why would we assume that God created that? It could just be that a spontaneous order, which we know exists in the universe, created this. We also know that all these laws working together means that you can't just take one law out and another one will fill the void. The laws of the universe all work together. Now you might say, aha, somebody must have made them work together. But no, if they didn't work together, we wouldn't have a universe. We wouldn't be here talking about it. If physics and all these things just didn't work, we wouldn't be here. So it's only because we're here that we ask these questions. It's only because it works that we have any universe to talk about at all. There might be an infinite number of failed universes. There might be out there in other dimensions, many failed universes where the laws of physics don't work so neatly. And we might just be in the one example where things work. So it might just be, again, random chance, thousands of dice rolls out in the universe, random things happening at multiple planes of existence. And it just so happens that this one exists, and if it didn't have consistent laws, it would have collapsed a long time ago. It would have fallen apart. So we're just lucky that we happen to be in the universe that exists. But it's not even luck. If we weren't here, we wouldn't be here to question it. So it's not luck. It's a process of elimination. It's a process of exception. It's a process of survivor's bias. That we are the only ones that exist. We have survived the many collapsing universes. So, of course, we're able to ask those questions, whereas other universes didn't get that chance. To be honest, The universe is not orderly, it's not a clockwork, it's not beautiful and perfect. It is easily explainable through through scientific laws that are themselves messy and hard to put together. The teleological argument has no basis whatsoever. We don't live in the world that is described in the teleological argument, and if we did, it still wouldn't prove the existence of God. It's just relatively simple to say that. We don't live in a clockwork universe, and if we did, there might be another explanation for that. Again, for these arguments to work, they must be necessarily true, not just nice to have. The next argument for the existence of God is the moral argument. That's the idea that we all know what's right and wrong. We know that it's wrong to murder. We know that it's wrong to harm other people. We know that equality is good. We know that sharing is good. Who put that there? Why do we have those moral conceptions, and why are they across culture if God didn't decide what's good? Furthermore, if we don't have God tell us what's morally good and morally bad, then we don't have any beliefs in what's moral or immoral. We are essentially floundering. So in other words, to reject God is to reject that there is any truth or justice in the world at all, and we just fall into moral relativism. So it's two kind of arguments in one. It's one saying that we must have God to explain why we have moral beliefs, and if we didn't, though, everything would fall apart. That it's a sort of a threat as well. Well, this argument is, I mean, shouldn't even need anybody to debate with it. It's so inherently weak. First of all, every culture, every person has a different conception of what's good and bad. Now, obviously, most cultures agree that murder is bad, except we don't really, do we? We conceptualize that murdering members of our own tribe or group is usually bad, but if they're like a criminal, we still have the death penalty. If we go to war, we still kill others. We don't always believe that killing is wrong. Now, we tend to have an emotional impact when we kill somebody. People who have done a lot of war have PTSD, so there's, on some internal level, we know that these things are wrong, but those might be cultural artifacts. If we were in a different culture, we might feel differently about the people that we kill. There are other moral conceptions that are just not true across cultures. Like, not everyone believes that theft is wrong. In some cultures, taking another person's tool or another item is perfectly acceptable, and they don't consider it theft. Some people believe that it's wrong to kill animals, and others believe that it's not. There is no moral center in humanity, and one might argue that the moral center that's there is more logically tied to just the survival of our species. If we just murdered each other all the time and it was a normal part of our existence, we would have stopped existing a long time ago. We'd have died off. We need to have some sort of empathy in order for the human race to survive. There are other animal species where the males of a species might kill the offspring if they run into them again. And some species that take care of their child early in birth and then let them go, and if they run into another species, they might kill them. So the idea of human morality isn't universal to all intelligent or all species. And human morality isn't universal either. There's a lot of things that are different. And even if we say that some things are at the core of our morality, there are some cultures that reject parts of those. And when you look at specific case-by-case basis, we don't all agree on what's right and wrong in any one case. But even if we did, that wouldn't prove the existence of God. If we all shared the exact same moral code, it could be down to our genetics or a survival trait. It could be just a coincidence. It could be like a necessary part of our development. There's many explanations for why we might have a shared morality other than God. And even if we have God, and yet we don't have shared morality. We have many religious texts that argue about what's moral and what's not. So to argue that God is necessary to have moral consistency, God is one of the reasons why we don't have moral consistency. The belief in God is different across different cultures, and they have different morality. And the bits that are shared obviously don't come from the same God, because if they did, then we would have the same religion across the world, and we don't. So there must be a cause that is not from God in order to get those different moralities, or for the shared morality, because we're not sharing the same God. In other words, it is impossible that morality comes from God. Not only is there another possible explanation, this belief is based on something that is literally not true. So either humans are not bound by the ethics and morality of God, or morals are relative. In other words, the moral argument for the existence of God falls apart on so many levels. It's probably one of the worst arguments for the existence of God, and fails on even the most basic level of understanding of human morality and ethics. What about what's called the sensus divinus? This is the sense of the divine, that when we look into the universe, we sense a need for God. Well, I don't, and I'm a human being. So, and I never have, and I know many people that don't. So the idea that we have this sense of divine is not true. Some people do, some people don't. I look at the universe and I find it to be spectacular, but not because I believe there must be some divine order to it all, but merely it's beautiful in itself, but that it is a beautiful thing to look at. You might say, well, what caused you to that beauty? Well, cultural norms do, and survival instinct and other things like that. But I don't have a sense of the divine. I have a sense of beauty and a sense of wonder, but not in the divine, and many people don't. So this argument falls apart because that is just not factually correct. That brings us to the next argument for God, which is the argument from aesthetic experience. The idea that truth is beauty and beauty is truth. That the fact that even if we all have different ideas of what's beautiful, there are certain things that are universally beautiful to us, to all of us, and that must be created by God. Like if we look at a sunset, we pretty much all see that it's beautiful. Except that's not true, is it? Because if the sunset has certain colors, certain people might worry about it. Like there's that expression, red sky at night, sailors delight, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. A sailor might look at that sunrise that I see is beautiful and might say, ugh, it's going to be a bad day. Right. There are many things that we all see differently and see beauty in different ways. So the idea that we have universal standards of beauty on anything is simply false and relatively easy to disprove. But even if it were true, that we all look at certain things and say, this is beautiful, that really is a non sequitur when it comes to God. We might all believe that things are beautiful because we have a common ancestry going back through generations of evolution, and maybe it is a useful trait for us to see beauty in the world, or to see the world in a certain way that conceptualizes it as beauty. That we have culturally decided this means beauty. But we might look at an open sky and think it means freedom, and that freedom might be an important part of our cultural or personal makeup that is true for all cultures. So even if there was a universal sense of beauty, it doesn't mean it was caused or put there by God. There could be many, many explanations for why we all have a sense of beauty. It might be through evolution. It might be because all humans share to some degree culture. In other words, we all come from an original African culture, and it may be that culture has certain cultural beliefs that has spread through our culture through generations, right? Or it could very well be that there isn't a universal sense of beauty. Even if we were to say that it was caused, maybe it was caused through a random mutation. Maybe it's caused by a god who put the sense of beauty in our head, but that's all they did. There's this God who's just like, I want people to feel beauty. I created beauty, and then I cease to exist. I mean, why not? If we're presupposing that God exists just because people find different things beautiful, why not just say it was a God of beauty and that's all they did? So the next argument for the existence of God is often called the argument for the existence of arguments, or the existence of logic. It's something that has been talked about by C.S. Lewis and other people like that. And that's the idea that if we want to say something's true or false, there must be a central source of rationality or truth, or else our rational arguments don't mean anything. That they're basically just as good to say something rational as something irrational if there's no central source of truth, nothing that created rationality, nothing that held on to that idea. And essentially, how can we make a rational argument without appealing to a logic that is outside of human experience? I would argue that it's relatively obvious that that's not true. The whole basis of the scientific method, the entire basis of the scientific method, is based on saying observations about the universe as we see it and as we experience it, with the understanding that those beliefs could be wrong. In other words, falsifiability is a central tenet of science. All rationality, all science presupposes that we could be wrong. So the idea that there is a universal truth necessary for rationality is exactly the opposite. If there was a universal truth, we probably wouldn't even need rationality. We could just appeal to that truth and not bother with the arguments. It's because there's uncertainty in the universe. It's because we don't know all the facts that rationality is necessary. It is, if rationality relied on absolute truth, some outside body that created the universe and created truth. First of all, that wouldn't prove the universe was created by God at all anyway. It would just mean that there's some sort of source for that truth. It could be almost anything. It doesn't have to be God. But if there was this universal sense of truth and rationality, and it was out in the universe, then we could just look to that every time we needed facts. But the reality is we don't know where our logic is going to lead us from time to time. We don't have an agreed upon truth or reality to the universe. It's always being discovered and uncovered. And sometimes we're upending things that we believe to be true in the past. So the idea that we are appealing to a central truth is just against the very nature of science, which is always questioning truth. Now, you might say, but there's still underpinning that some sense of rationality that must be outside of our own personal experience. But I would argue that no. Rationality and logic are products of language and the way we understand words and conceptualize ideas, not the other way around. Logic and rationality don't exist outside of our ability to talk about them. If we look at non-human animal species, they don't logic their way through a problem. They act with instinct. They may have feelings attached to it, but we can almost certainly agree that they're not arguing like Aristotle over the philosophy of this particular animal species and what they believe. We don't have any reason to believe that they are engaged in that sense of rationality, because rationality is a product of human language. Now, what underpins that rationality, the sense that the universe is in some way orderly or follows rules, is already something we explored in previous arguments. That general sense that the universe has laws that we are uncovering using our language through rationality, a human construct, that there are those laws that we are actually interrogating, and those laws are real, are natural laws. They follow from the universe as we've observed it. They could be wrong. Like all of our understandings about physics could be wrong. And the fact that those things can be wrong is why we have rationality in the first place. So when we look at the universe and say that there are certain things that are true about the universe, we're not necessarily saying that these are true in a cosmic, universal, capital T sense, but rather our current understanding of the universe, it follows through our conception, our human conception of logic, that this other thing must be true. And if it turns out to be true, well, then we're lucky that our logic and science has led us to this fact. But there isn't a universal source for logic or science. And we know that the basis of science isn't absolute fact or truth, but rather conjecture based on the evidence we have. In other words, falsifiability. The fact that falsifiability exists, or that we can be wrong, is the only reason why we have rationality at all. What about the argument from the existence of free will? This is the idea that we have the ability to change our world, to make choices, and God must have given us that free will. To be honest, this argument is a muddle. It doesn't really make any sense. It's not consistent at all. And I don't mean this because I don't understand it. I understand it, but it's illogical. It doesn't make sense. First of all, if things were deterministic through the existence of God, like God created the universe and had a plan for it, then we don't have free will. So arguing that the fact we have free will proves God, when really God disproves free will, doesn't make sense. Like, if we say that God is involved in the universe and can do anything and has a plan for the universe, then arguing we have free will is really completely illogical. If you argue, on the other hand, God just created the universe but doesn't engage in it, well, then God has no real bearing on the universe, like has no direct impact. It's humans that decide what we're going to do with it. So if God did exist in that way, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't have any effect. So why even try and prove the existence of something that has no effect on us? Or it might be that the universe is random and controlled, and if that's a fact, it doesn't matter how it makes us feel inside, it's just true. Or it could be that we do have free will and can enact change in the universe. I have a theory that says that there's some small amount of free will mixed in with all of this determinism, but that doesn't mean that God put it there. There's no reason to even make that leap. Why not just say a pony put it there, or a hat put it there? Like, why jump from the fact that we have free will to say that God must have put it there? There's no logic to it. And if God did do it, then it means we don't have free will. If God put it there, then God decided. We didn't. So the argument from free will is inherently internally contradictory and has never really made any sense. It's a worthless argument from any perspective. So what about the argument from miracles? This is the idea that there are certain things in history that could not have been explained outside of the existence of God. People who survive amazing car crashes, or who fall out of a plane and land unscathed, or they find a key to a door that they thought was lost and nobody believed it to be real, and they found it, and inside was a treasure, and the treasure saved their life and their family's life. How do we explain this if there are no miracles, if there's no God? Well, there could still be a cosmic or karmic order to the universe without God. Without the conception of a universal, infinite being. The idea that karma is like a free-flowing form of fairness and justice energy that flows through the universe doesn't mean that it was put there by God, or but that is God. That's a spiritual belief that doesn't have to rely on God, although it tends to. Like, the karmic belief is attached to belief in a God, but I'm saying it doesn't necessarily have to be. But it also could be that most of the people, that these miracles, a lot of them are lies. I mean, throughout history, we have been able to demonstrate that a lot of the things that people said were miraculous were simply untrue, were lies that people said. And we didn't have videotape evidence or photographs at the time, so we can't prove whether they happened. We do know that some people fall out of an airplane and survive. But those are usually relatively easily scientifically explainable through chance. There are millions of people every day who put themselves in dangerous and deadly situations. Some of them die and some of them don't. The ones that survive, the survivorship bias again coming into it, the ones that survive are the ones that we tell stories about. The ones that didn't are the ones we don't. Through random chance, there's a chance that if I throw this thing, it's going to land directly in my nearby water cup. I can just throw it randomly, and it might land in there. And if I throw it 1,000 times, it might very well land in there once. That's not a miracle. That's just luck. So most miracles are lies. Most miracles did not happen. And even those religious scholars agree that a lot of these things that we said were miracles were simply not. Among those things that were miracles, they can be easily explained through science, luck, or people misremembering the situation. There's really nothing that can be argued is a total miracle. And just because something can't be explained by science, by the way, doesn't mean that it couldn't eventually be explained by science. That's one of the things about what's the whole point of science in the first place, is to interrogate and examine the universe and find out things we didn't know. So we should expect that there should be things we can't explain yet. Because if there wasn't, if we could explain everything, there'd be no need for science. And in fact, I'd have a stronger belief in God if we could explain everything. The other question about miracles is, why don't they happen to people who really deserve them? There are many people that deserved a miracle and didn't get one, and many evil people that got a miracle that didn't deserve it. To me, these miracles, when they happen, are proof that God doesn't exist, that random chance plays a role, because there's no arbiter that decided that Hitler should have survived his first 3 assassination attempts and only be able to kill himself, whereas some child is born with cancer and dies before they're 3 years old. That's not a miracle. If that is a miracle, then God is evil, and I don't want to believe in him. So the argument that miracles are proof of God is ludicrous. Another argument is Pascal's wager. Now, this isn't really an argument. This is the idea that Pascal came up with, where let's make a bet that God doesn't exist. If you bet that God doesn't exist, and God does exist, you'll go to hell. If you make a bet that God does exist, and he does exist, you go to heaven. And when you go to heaven, you live a wonderful afterlife, and it's great. But if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, well, then there's no harm in it. You die, you don't go to hell because hell doesn't exist. There was no harm in it. And if you guess that God doesn't exist and he doesn't exist, then there's no harm in that either. There's no difference. So the argument is that the safer bet is to go with God, because if God does exist and you say there's no God, you go to hell. And if God does exist and you say that God does exist, you go to heaven. But that's not an argument for the existence of God. That's just telling you to be afraid of using logic. That's just telling you to not think about things too much, because you might end up being punished. That's not logic. That's not science. That's just fear-mongering. And it's not even a very strong argument. what if we do believe in God, but God punishes those who believe in the Christian God because it's actually only the Islamic God that's real, and he just abandoned Christian beliefs a long time ago, and if you say you're Christian, he sends you into some other realm of torture. Or let's say God didn't create any of the religions. God is the first creator, and when you die, you meet God, and he goes, oh, you believed in God? Yeah, that's weird. I'm going to put you in weird zone. Or maybe when you meet God, he's the Catholic God, or some God in some other place that if you don't believe these specific things, these exact tenets, you go to hell. As soon as God exists, you can't predict what's going to happen when you die. If God is real, you have to just hope that you got the right one through random chance. So, in fact, it doesn't help your chances statistically at all to believe in God, because it doesn't just go that God says, oh, you believed in me, therefore you get to go to heaven. It's if you believe the specific correct tenets and follow the exact plan that you don't know about. That's a pretty fickle God. He doesn't deserve my worship. So if God does exist and he punishes you for not believing, he's a bad God. And if he doesn't exist, which is much more likely, then it doesn't matter that I believe those things. But if God does exist, there's no guarantee I found the right one. I may be no closer to being correct. In fact, God might even say, I told you not to have any graven idols. You followed Christ and have all these Christ depictions. Those are graven idols. I've decided that you're going to go to hell. But this atheist who didn't do any of those things but lived a good life, I'm going to put him in heaven. It might very well be that it is more dangerous to believe in God than to not believe in God, because we don't know what God's like, and God is ultimately unknowable in most of these religions anyway. So to say that you understand God and know him is to show that you don't understand religion at all. You don't understand what you're even talking about. So the idea of Pascal's wager relies on you not understanding what God is and being afraid to think. It's a terrible and puerile belief. It's not worth our time in terms of analysis, although it's interesting to put things in some sort of grid if you like putting things in grids. The ontological argument for the existence of God is another one that's on this list, and it's dumb. It's the idea that if you can imagine the greatest being that is possible to conceive. That if you can imagine the greatest thing you can possibly conceive, well, one of the things that makes something great is that it exists. And so if you imagine this is so stupid. If you can imagine a thing so great that it must exist, then it must exist, because it wouldn't be the greatest thing if it didn't exist. This is also proof for why the greatest unicorn in the world exists and the greatest butt plug in the world exists. That if I imagine the greatest one possible, well, it's not that great if it doesn't exist, so it must exist. Me again, jumping in with some extra bit of context. I don't think I did a great job of explaining just how ludicrous the ontological argument is. I've seen people online asking questions about it, and usually the only response is just to reiterate the argument that if you imagine something, if we were to say that there's the greatest thing possible, it therefore must exist because part of greatness is existing. I just don't think I've really explained just how many massive flaws there are in this line of reasoning in every permutation, from Gödel through Anselm. Just every version of it is massively flawed. Apart from the fact that if I imagine the greatest pizza in the world, it's going to have to exist, and I'm going to have to be able to eat it. I mean, I can't imagine a great pizza that everyone can't enjoy. I can't imagine a great pizza that just doesn't exist. I mean, if a pizza's great, it must exist in order to be good. You can't say I've got this amazing pizza, but it doesn't exist. So the greatest pizza must exist, and it must be enough for everyone to eat. It must feed the whole world. I mean, think about how great this pizza would have to be. There'd have to be no starvation anywhere in the world due to this pizza. And it should be easily accessible. I mean, if it's not easily accessible, then it could be greater. So the greatest pizza in the world must be everywhere and must be delicious and everyone must love it. And even if you're lactose intolerant, you can eat the pizza. I mean, in order to imagine the greatest pizza in the world, I have to create a scenario that's so ridiculously untrue. You can't even imagine it being any more unrealistic. But that's how we use the ontological argument. The ontological argument says that this is just the greatest thing possible and therefore it must exist. But that should apply to anything else that you apply those same arbitrary characteristics to. It might be that existence isn't great, that there's nothing inherently good about existing, that something in the mind or the imagination can be as great as something in the real world. If that's the case, then the ontological argument doesn't help us with God at all. But even if we say that the greatest thing in the world, the greatest thing possible, exists, that could just be the universe itself. Remember, I think if God had a personality and could decide arbitrary decisions and was still allowing children to die at childbirth, that's not really a great God. That's actually a God who's kind of venal and selfish. I would think a greater God would be dispassionate, have no favorites, would basically be essentially the void of the universe itself, something that just contains and is everything, but doesn't have a personality that can be flawed. So the ontological argument might prove that the universe exists, but not that God exists. Even if it proves that God exists, it certainly doesn't prove that the Christian God exists, because any of the individual versions of God we have in the world isn't the greatest thing we could imagine. God, remember, created people and put them in the Garden of Eden, and then put the tree right in the middle of the Garden of Eden. That seems like a flaw, and indeed, God didn't expect them to eat the apple. He got mad at them when they did, or when they ate the fruit that he said they shall not eat. So that seems like a mistake God made, or maybe it's part of his plan. But shouldn't it be clear, if somebody's truly the greatest thing possible, shouldn't their plan be relatively clear if they have one? Shouldn't they not be punishing people for no good reason? I mean, certainly a greater person than that would actually be more patient and more loving. They say that God is infinitely loving, but I'm still going to go to hell for not believing in God? That seems like a God who's contradictory. So if we follow the ontological argument, we can't accept the Christian God. We must reject the Christian God as being not great enough to fit that. It also might be that greatness itself it doesn't include existence. And it also is a problem that basically anything you imagine where you just attach the word greatest to it now fits the ontological argument just as well, from pizza to unicorns to anything you can imagine. And there has never been an argument that dismantled these other than just reiterating the same points. In fact, there were parodies of the ontological argument going back as early as when the argument first came out. There's always been people that have been mocking this ridiculous idea, and the people that are supporting it tend to just sort of say, well, it must be true. But there's no strength to this argument. So I want to be very clear that in the video, I explain some of the flaws and the ludicrous assumptions being made by this argument, but it goes way deeper than I went in this article. And honestly, you would go on for hours picking apart all the ridiculous interpretations that would be possible if the ontological argument was valid. You could argue that, like, God exists because we think about him. Like, because the idea of God is a concept in the brain, therefore there's a pattern in the brain that we could identify as God. But that doesn't mean that God, in the sense of having all those powers, exists. That just means that the thought of a God exists. The ontological argument is one of the dumbest arguments that has ever been conceived by any being or any thought. If you're just saying something's the greatest thing that could exist, therefore it must exist, is stupid. It really is like below third grade level of thought. And it's shocking that any philosophers in history ever thought this was a good argument. It was not. There's one more argument I want to cover for the existence of God, and this is one I don't really know the correct term for this. Essentially, it's often termed as the 2 + 2 = 4 argument for the existence of God. That is, if there are laws and beliefs and rules that we can come up with, these things properly exist in the mind. But they would be true whether or not we were alive or not. In other words, 2 + 2 = 4 would be true whether there were any humans in the universe or not. It would still be true that 2 + 2 = 4. So where does that truth come from, if not from an all-knowing God? Well, we might argue that it could come from anything. It could be spontaneously created. It could be from a naturalistic universe. But the argument is that well, if there's 2 plus 2 equals 4 and all these other rules, there's an infinite number of rules. Only an infinite being could have conceived of such an infinite number of rules, and rules like that can only exist in the mind, but they must have existed before humans came into being, before there was any life in the universe, because they've always existed. They've always been ideas. And if they were ever untrue, it would mean that the universe didn't exist. So, because these ideas predate existence and are an infinite number, they must have been conceived by an infinitely powerful being. Now, this argument, again, doesn't really have much connective tissue in it, because it confuses two different things. On the one hand, you have stuff, materials, that is, like, say, a blue truck. On the other hand, you have the idea or understanding of that truck. That I've seen it and I've observed it and I understand that that blue truck exists. That's a thought that's in my head. The fact that this truck exists in the universe, first of all, it's not necessarily called a truck or a blue truck in other languages or other conceptions of the universe, but the matter that makes up that truck exists and on some level factually exists. Instead of a truck, it's 2 plus 2 equals 4, let's say it's a truck. That's a immutable law of the universe. There's a blue truck at the beginning, at the center of the sky somewhere. Somewhere out in the great attractor where the universe began, there was a blue truck. I know you're thinking that's a ludicrous example, and why am I trying to undermine it that way? I'm just trying to simplify it. We have the thing, in other words, the 2 plus 2 equals 4 law, or the truck itself. And then we have the understanding of that. The understanding that there's a blue truck in the center of the sky. The understanding of 2 plus 2 equals 4. Those two things are not the same thing. There's some stuff in the universe that we've never observed and may never observe, but it still exists. So it's possible for something to exist without anybody understanding it or believing it. There could be rules or laws of the universe that nobody has ever conceived of or ever seen that still exist nonetheless. When material things exist, they exist outside of our perception or the perception of any being. So you don't need a being in order for there to be this thing, this 2 plus 2 equals 4. In order to understand that rule, you need something to do the understanding. Perhaps you need humans to understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in order for us to have an understanding that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But you don't need humans or any consciousness in order to have that thing just exist. So the fact that there are laws in the universe doesn't imply that there must be somebody to have conceived of those laws. Those laws might be naturally occurring, and it is the understanding of them that requires a thinker, not to cause them to exist in the first place. 2 plus 2 might equal 4 just because of the way the universe happens to exist. Through a series of coincidences and random chance, the universe came into existence. And as a result of that, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And all the other laws, to be honest, are all connected to those same rules. Because 2 plus 2 equals 4, it also follows that 4 plus 4 equals 8, that 8 plus 8 equals 16. These aren't a bunch of separate laws that somebody conceived of. There aren't an infinite number of different laws. There's one law, that is the way that the universe basically exists. And all of these subsets are just different ways of understanding those laws. Now, you might say, all of those things put together, that's what God is. God is when you put all of those ideas together into one thing, that's what God is. But that's not what the argument's making. That's not the argument the argument's making. And that would be a pretty ridiculous argument anyway. It's redefining God to be whatever you feel like at the time. To say, well, I found a door, that's what God is. See, and that's the thing about these arguments. They make a very poor attempt to try and demonstrate that God exists. They're very easy to refute from a purely logical level. But they're more difficult to refute if we just take them on faith. If we say God exists because I believe that he exists and he exists beyond your sense of rationality, that's a harder one to disagree with. If you just believe in God because you think that he exists and because it feels good to believe in God, or because you actually know in your heart that God exists, then you don't need these arguments. You can just believe in God and not try and prove it to people using logic. Logic doesn't very rightfully apply to an object that, or an item, or an entity that by its very nature goes beyond logic, goes beyond human understanding, that people say is unknowable. Logic can't define such a being. So we should stop trying to apply logic to prove it, because the arguments for God from a logic perspective are very weak and easily destroyed. But your faith in God isn't. It might be that God does exist, that all of these arguments are wrong. Remember, I haven't proven that God doesn't exist. All I've done is I've proven that the arguments in favor of God are weak. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. I might die and find out that God does exist. And then I would sort of say, sorry, dude, I guess I thought you didn't exist. And hopefully I can be forgiven, or maybe I'll end up in hell. I don't know what happens after you die. The point is that the arguments in favor of God are weak, not that believing in God is inherently wrong. It's just an irrational belief. It's not based in logic, and it can't be, because God does things that defy logic, defy human understanding. So if you want to believe in God because you believe in God, not because of some old philosopher who was trying to desperately come up with an argument that would prove what they already believed before they started, or what they needed to believe so they wouldn't be killed for heresy. These arguments were never very strong, and the only reason they were believed in the first place is because of cultural and social pressure.